Chapter 9. Meeting with Dr. Barlow on Concerns of Health. Cameron's next appointment came sooner than he expected. It was Wednesday afternoon, on his last day off, when he drove to the West Blainsville Medical Center for his follow-up checkup. This time, he only spent a few minutes in the waiting room before they were ready for him. He was in lower spirits then. His left eye, which had begun hurting shortly after his first visit with Dr. Eakins, had only gotten worse, and he didn't want to overwhelm them with several issues at once. Cameron was not met with Dr. Eakins, but a younger man with slick dark hair and medium build with mildly striking features, which at first made Cameron believe him to be a younger intern rather than an official doctor. His eyes communicated a sense of long suffering and slight impatience, as if Cameron was compromising his busy schedule. "Hello, I'm Rudy Barlow. You must be Cameron Detail?" he inquired, in a disinterested, flat voice, but not without maintaining civility. "Yes. Is Dr. Eakins not available today?" He was the one who initially looked at me, Cameron asked, with a look of bemusement. "We'll get to that later. It's kind of hard to explain at the moment. Why don't you follow me over to my office where we can get started right away?" Before Cameron could respond, Dr. Barlow did an about-face and began walking in large strides toward the hallway entrance. The corridor was blocked, as before, except with even more new construction taking place in the walls, in which new walls and doors were being installed. Avoiding scaffolding, ladders, paint cans, and considerable debris, Cameron followed Dr. Barlow into his office. "Watch your step," said Dr. Barlow, but not until Cameron had already traversed the rubble. "Fortunately, they were renovating all these older spots where there's been considerable mold growth and infectious air, thus the extra air filtering measures. Unfortunately, their work has now moved to our wing, but once this hospital is properly gentrified, it will be one of the top medical centers in the district." He said this with a certain sense of pride. Once they entered through the solid oak windowless door of the office, Dr. Barlow reached for the light and motioned for Cameron to sit down. Once the light was turned on, it was revealed that the room was not in a formal office, but a storage room that was being repurposed as a provisional one. Dr. Barlow explained, "I apologize for the inconvenient setting. If I could use my office without a doubt, I would. But considering the current renovations, it unfortunately won't be available. These are the best accommodations that I can offer at the moment." Dr. Barlow pushed a janitor's mop and broom out of the way as if to make the scene more convincing. "It's no problem. You seem like a talented doctor. I'm sure you can do your job well despite the setbacks," Cameron said. "Well, thank you. You're too kind. I'm really only a rookie doctor. So what brings you in today? Dr. Eakins told me a little bit more about you, but I'd like to hear what you have to say," Dr. Barlow asked, folding his arms in anticipation. "I've been having some trouble sleeping, and have been having terribly strange dreams," said Cameron, hoping this would be all he would have to explain. "I see. Could you elaborate a little further on the exact details of the dreams?" Dr. Barlow said, as he took a seat on the stool. Like Dr. Eakins, he did not write anything down. Cameron explained the whole range of events, the ostensibly paranormal, fantastical, frightening, geometrical, philosophical, anthropological, ecumenical, and every other last detail he had the cerebral power to conjure up. He told Dr. Barlow everything from Mr. Tiberius to Mr. Spencer, and more recently, Mr. Hollander and his untimely explosion. He mentioned the long impassioned speeches, the over-intellectualizing, the recounting of old memories, the pessimistic woes of Mr. Spencer and the idle fury of Mr. Hollander. Cameron even had the confidence to tell him of Mr. Tiberius's appearance in the real world, or what he believed to be the real world. It all took a good 10 or 15 minutes to relay, with Dr. Barlow finally deigning to take notes, and though he kept a poker face, it was evident that he was thoroughly bemused by Cameron's descriptions, which were comprehensive and as precise as can be. Finally, he responded, "Well, it certainly sounds like the case of some kind of trauma occurring in your life," he began, after sighing with slight uneasiness. "Your dreams are most likely a response to those stimuli of distressing life events, possibly major ones. Have you gone through a divorce recently?" "No, I haven't," Cameron replied. "Haven't even got a marriage to start with." "Any losses of family members or close ones?" Dr. Barlow asked again. "No." Cameron was confused as to how this had transitioned into a kind of cross-examination. What about personal psychological trauma? Did anything happen in your mind that caused it to break down in some way? Accumulation of too much stress can definitely compel you to shut down, and such nightmares may arise as a result. The brain tries to find answers, but sometimes fails to provide a logical framework from which we can garner a compass to navigate through the world, so we look for meaning in dreams, Dr. Barlow said with an air of confidence. Aside from the accounts I just gave, no psychological trauma on my part. It's just that these visions seem so real at times. Like I can walk in and out of them and not feel any difference. It's as if the lines between the real and the imagined have become more and more blurred, and it's increasingly hard for me to differentiate between the two. I can get the general sense when something is a dream, but when a character from that same unconscious state suddenly shows up in the real world, that's when I begin to question the limits of my perception. I know I probably sound crazy. No, not at all, assured Dr. Barlow, but you must be aware of the possibility that all these are indeed a product of your brain. To put it simply, the brain is a very deep, profoundly complex ocean of sorts that science has really only just begun to scratch the surface of. It's a mystery that cannot be fully understood. If it could, then it would be a very sad day, as we experts would have to soon renounce our jobs because we wouldn't be needed anymore. However, that is not to say that we cannot work out what part of your conscious, awake states are in fact dreaming or not. Scientists can positively conclude which parts of your brain are producing fantasy and which are true, conscious experience. So, you are claiming to see a giant eyeball walking on the street. Well, this is most likely the appearance of heightened sense perception, when even in broad daylight things become muddled and skewed. And you saw it because the mind creates all kinds of peculiar obstacles and objects to throw in your path, but they cannot be a physical reality. There's just no way. Dr. Barlow said this in a more incredulous manner. But it all appeared to be a real material image. I saw him in front of me when I was awake. I remember clearly. There's no mistaking that. That cannot even distinguish what's true anymore, Cameron said, with a tinge of desperation in his now frail voice. Listen, I understand the dilemma completely. If there is one thing I am not, it is unempathetic. But I want to be as honest as I can and not leave any details out. I wouldn't be able to live with myself if I did that. But I have to be pragmatic. It is my duty. What I described to you could very well be a case of hyper-realistic hallucinations. They are possible, but usually are linked inextricably to some form of mental disorder, primarily schizophrenia, which affects your ability to think, behave, and feel normally. Often, in schizophrenics, there is a degradation between reality as you know it and the unreal, and there is a breakdown. So the perception may be altered, abnormal, and this causes them to withdraw from the real world and slip into fantasy. Does this sound like you? Dr. Barlow spoke with some hesitance, looked up from his notebook at Cameron with dubious eyes. If you categorize everything I said as simply a delusion and no more, I suppose that somehow that makes me a schizo. But I know what I saw. I felt it. Most schizophrenics do. They all say a similar thing. How real it all appears. So real, in fact, that they can't even differentiate between the hallucination and what is not anymore. Discernment goes away, leaving the sufferer in a delirious state. The other possibility, and I'd hate to jump to even more conclusions, a nascent brain tumor of some kind. Often those with temporal lobe tumors pressing against the optic path may experience hallucinations. Worst case scenario is psychosis, but I've already scared you with enough possibilities. Dr. Barlow seemed to be becoming more and more skeptical of Cameron. But I don't have any of those characteristics of a schizophrenic. While I've had a painful eye, I've gotten better at that. I haven't gotten anything that feels like a tumor. Sure, you could jot down 2 or 3 traits, but that's not a proper diagnosis. Though I'm not a doctor. I don't have any other problem confronting reality or with my own mind aside from said nightmares and visions. Aside from that, I'm perfectly normal. Now, calm down now. I'm not making any definitive statements here. I'm simply making conjectures so I can string together into some kind of positive description for a diagnosis. But for now, we're just talking. I apologize for coming off that way. To put it simply, it is a tricky business because the source of which you are making the claims is also the very place where these judgments have room for deflection or even unreliability. You seem to be, aside from the minor dietary issue, a perfectly healthy individual, but I've seen cases of schizophrenia in apparently healthy people too. Listen, I just don't want to be pegged as crazy. Do you know how much that could affect my life? If I'm written off as insane, I might not be able to work again, or worse yet, I could be locked away in a mental institution. Cameron became insecure again, fidgeting in his chair while entertaining every foulest scenario he could envision. Oh, hold on a minute. There's absolutely no need for such concerns. Under our medical overseer contract, we agree to the terms that bind us not to make drastic life-changing decisions. You may be surprised at the new changes in these laws and regulations in the field of medicine. To put it simply, they are much better than they used to be. You can be fully insured as well. You're in good hands here. Diagnosing someone as mentally unstable is a very long, methodical process that can take months, even years. That is typically the worst-case situation. Most of the time, however, it is a temporary diagnosis at most. Nothing is set in stone. Dr. Barlow held up a copy of the front page of the contract in Cameron's view, but scarcely gave him time to read it. Cameron surmised that he might very well be hallucinating at this very moment, that the contract, hospital room, diagnosis, and especially Dr. Barlow were all the construct of his imagination. Realizing this irony, he laughed to himself in a distracted manner. Okay, good. I respect that process. To think that back in the day, then have all these binding legal contracts, so doctors and practitioners could simply label someone as crazy and shut them up in asylum for life without properly treating them. As a result, there was a lot of abuse and inhumane treatment of patients, especially in the Victorian era. There's no way that would be allowed today, Cameron said, remembering an article he had read on medical history a few weeks earlier when he was doing some independent research into medical history and what the fate of the mentally ill was like. It was moments like these that made him appreciate the advances of science and medicine, and the fact that the worst hospitals in Blainesville were far better than those of the past. Look at how far we've come, said Dr. Barlow, almost derisively, collecting his accumulated papers for the session and compiling them together in a neat stack, which he used to lightly strike the desk twice, non-verbally, marking the end of the meeting. The field of medicine has certainly triumphed considerably over the last century. It's thanks to these little patient-doctor interactions like these that we can glean more knowledge of our trade. After all, most of what we learnt of the mind comes simply from two people vying with each other, trying to make some sense out of the psyche. I'm surprised you can make sense of anything I told you today, Doctor, said Cameron. I've received nothing but blank stares and uncomfortable silences from nearly everyone I've talked to about this. The brain is an enigma, that's for sure. True, but while the mind is a very arduous enigma, your queries can be resolved, began Dr. Barlow, tugging at his shirt collar as if to release something trapped inside. I don't mean to sound unfeeling or dismissive, but most of what you are seeing is the product of sensations in the or neurological makeup reacting. Nothing more. Every last detail of your dream can be explained by the sciences, neurosciences, psychology, biology, and medical textbooks most of all. That's why they're there, to elucidate and make that which is obfuscated and uncertain clear. I can positively say that your dreams are nothing more than a product of your environment in biology. If your diet is poor and the workplace is stress-inducing, expect your dreams to be reflective of that poor health and stilted well-being and everything else you've suppressed or mistreated. If you simply change your diet and mindset, these haunting, disturbing dreams will vanish. Mark my words. I understand, but I have a hard time believing that all of these images that appear to my flesh are just illusory, Cameron stated, pressing his index finger against his temple in a motion of disbelief. That's exactly how the mind works. The mind-body problem is a very awkward challenge in not only the sciences, but throughout human life. But that's not to say we should lose faith in our ability to positively distinguish the real from the fantasy. And what you're experiencing is clearly the latter, just through the marred filter of your imagination. Dr. Barlow said this in such a confident manner that Cameron gave up in challenging him further. He instead switched the subject, as he couldn't suppress his curiosity any longer. I see. So what happened to Dr. Eakins? You see, began Dr. Barlow with a sober, gloomy tone, Dr. Eakins has actually been missing for almost 5 days now. Police and investigators are on the hunt as we speak, and they're ready to plan more wide-ranging search with many more people involved. It is a very difficult and sobering situation. I can only hope the best for him. We can only wish, cross our hearts, and pray that wherever he is, it's not a severe or unsafe circumstance. All I know is that, according to his wife, Dr. Eakins has been experiencing frantic problems with his head. He began seeing visions and ran off. That is all we know. In fact, I probably said too much. Wow, that's so unfortunate. I hope the police and everyone involved are successful and he's brought back safe and sound as soon as possible. Cameron offered his consolation in the best way he could, but winced at his inability to articulate his feelings. He also found it difficult to contain his shock at the news, holding his head down in a gesture of neutrality, remembering subtly just how much freedom Mr. Tiberius spoke of attaining. His heart sank. "We are all hoping the same thing," Dr. Barlow said, sighing. "Speaking of hoping," Dr. Barlow started again, changing his tone to a warmer one, "I do not have the prescription on me, but it's being shipped as we speak. I'd hate to leave you on a bad note, but—" Dr. Barlow's voice was drowned out by the overwhelming whir of a vacuum cleaner, which banged against the door, and his talking slowly melted away. As Dr. Barlow glanced mechanically at his watch, which banged against the door, and his talking slowly melted away. It was then that the session ended somewhat unexpectedly, as Dr. Barlow glanced mechanically at his watch. "I'd love to stay and work overtime to help you, but that's unfortunately against hospital rules. I wish you the best in figuring out this problem. Remember what I told you. The mind can play tricks. Do not listen to it. If something feels off, call me. I'm here Monday through Friday, 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. "Will do. And one more thing. This is very speculative, but if I were to be pegged as crazy later on, would I have your word to protect me?" Cameron asked with an air of timidity, not certain if he was out of bounds. "If we ever get to that point, which again, fingers crossed, I'm hoping we'll never do, then yes, you have my word," responded Dr. Barlow solemnly. With that, Cameron left the West Plainsville Medical Center and headed home. It had not been as productive a day as Cameron had hoped. He returned empty-headed, like a dejected beggar, with nowhere to find rest. So now he was a lunatic. The doctor himself had said it, in so many words at least, and he was done for. How would he ever find peace in this world with the senseless, beleaguering visions keeping him at bay, remaining numb by his own mind? He would simply be an insane older person with his foolish ideas to keep to himself. But Cameron made a decision that very night to do something practical about his problems, and to do it right away. He resolved to defeat Mr. Tiberius and the panoply of other characters that had occupied his weary mind night after night. How he would go about this was not exactly clear. He only knew that he had to do something about it before there was no mind left to toil with. Seeking mental help was out of the question. If Dr. Barlow had practically written him off as crazy, who's to say that even a mental professional wouldn't do the same? Or worse. Though the prospect of acquiring help from a specialist in neurology sounded initially promising, he somehow felt that it would simply lead to more trouble. He thought about not only losing his job, but also never being able to work again. Being stowed away in some lunatic detention center was no option, thought Cameron. He had to stand up for himself to maintain his freedom, because he slowly felt it slipping away. Another issue Cameron saw with seeking mental help, or pleading insanity as he called it, was that his mind lacked the supposed inconsistency and scattered nature of madness. Undoubtedly, his experiences involving his dream world were anything but consistent, yet he returned to the real world often, with enough clarity of mind to function, for the most part. However, the only way that occurred to him as genuinely promising was to face Mr. Tiberius himself again. He had felt a similar kind of sentiment long ago, but always sensed that he had the freedom in the real world, or at least he used to, until Mr. Tiberius pointed out that he was in fact very much a slave to his profession, and that he had little to no say in his life. Now that he had regained a semblance of control in his life, he felt his own mind slip into oblivion. It was as if the price of opening his eyes to the truth was his sanity. But Cameron reassured himself that even in the most charming moments, Mr. Tiberius was an immoral, corrupt, maleficent manipulator. That night, Cameron spooled over several more books on demonology and came across a page describing Aemon, a demon marquis of hell who governs 40 legions of demons in the seventh spirit of Goetia. He even considered seeking the help of a priest, but he wasn't sure if he had any place in the church, as his conversations with Mr. Tiberius had left him undecided on virtually everything, especially religion. In fact, his dialogues had only compounded Cameron's doubt about the universe at large and led him into the throes of the worst kind of depression, self-criticism, misgivings, and general anxiety. It was like the light illuminating truth was scattered and revealed, only to be washed out with countless more lights of equal or more value. He didn't know which truth was worth listening to, or which idea was the correct interpretation. In Mr. Tiberius's eye, they were all true in some Gnostic, all-encompassing, Vedantic way. At the same time, it made no sense to Cameron. There were seeds of it, of course, that had value, he thought. His perception of the arts and society, his poetic musing on religion, and his veneration of Buddhist truths all rang true in some ways. But they just did not hit home and seem to have any end goal tied to them. It seemed that, much of the time, Mr. Tiberius was simply externalizing a mammoth amount of inward speculation and introspection that had accumulated over countless years. He was delighted to find Cameron, because he now finally had a luckless surrogate onto whom he could deposit his endless philosophical adagios. Whether or not they were actually true didn't matter. The next day arrived abruptly, and Cameron realized that it was the day of his date with Cecil. What had he been thinking? He muttered to himself ruefully as he begrudgingly prepared himself in front of the mirror. It wasn't that he was dreading the meeting, just that his life had been so drastically affected by Mr. Tiberius's influence that he couldn't even speak solely for himself anymore. How could he have let that wretched eye get to him and influence his thoughts and behavior? Nevertheless, he still settled on going, and began the scrupulous task of plucking out a myriad of gray hairs that had recently revealed themselves. Damn these rogue hairs popping up, he muttered to himself, as if he were some kind of battered military commander weeding out subversive subordinates. He decided it would be silly to overdress by wearing a suit that would remind him of the workplace, too dull and proper. So he opted to wear a sports jacket with a casual shirt. Although Cameron did not consider himself well versed in the art of dressing well, he did stand out in his city, where most people didn't bother to wear more than the required legal amount. Around 6 in the evening, Cameron drove in his modest, older-style Honda Civic, which growled slightly because of either a bad muffler or a catalytic converter. Cameron hadn't tried to figure it out, as he neither had the means nor the time. He arrived at their chosen Italian-style restaurant in the east end of Blanesville, and had decided that it was best not to meet in the West End for obvious reasons. Cecil herself stated her preference for this part of town, which was not due to the resentment of any kind for the western section, but to a particular affinity for the glowing, prosperous district provided only by the East End. This was something of a relief to Cameron, as he didn't want to come off as a biased person who masked his hatred for any area. It was just that he knew that she was originally from the West area, and would not want to have offended her. Cameron parked his car in the nearly full parking lot and made his way inside. It was a refined and sensible enough business with a rustic-style design to set one at ease, and the prices were reasonable. Even that vague, distinct notion of Mr. Tiberius manifested itself in Cameron's mind, saying, "Ah, so you think you're in such a utilitarian manner now? What a perfect mix of all facets of approval, reasonable pricing, doable atmosphere, tolerable patrons, and most of all, decent food. What a dissident you are, my friend. You found the holy of holies. Next time you'll locate the gemstone of theaters that has affordable seating with endurable previews and isn't as hellish as the other ones. Cheap, tawdry entertainment comes at a price." Nevertheless, Cameron's mind remained unchanged, and he sat down at the table where he had awaited Cecil's arrival. "This is no time for Mr. Tiberius's intrusive antics," he said to himself, and those thoughts ceased to harass him for the majority of the evening. Roughly 5 or so minutes later, he had made out her familiar figure from the outside. She was particularly striking that evening, as she appeared to have put on an extra amount of effort into her clothing, though not without retaining her typical modesty. As she walked through the doors, Cameron got up from his seat and gave what he thought to be a chivalrous greeting, or at least the classiest one he could manage. "Hello, Cecil. How are you? You look beautiful today." At first, his voice sounded a bit too thin and wispy, and it bothered Cameron a great deal. However, the more he talked, the less he noticed. She gave one of her friendly, warm smiles and reciprocated the greeting. "Hi, Cameron. I'm well, thank you. I normally don't dress for occasions, even special ones," she said. Cameron motioned for them to sit down, and promptly afterwards, the waiter brought a pitcher of water. "Well, I guess this is a very special occasion, then," Cameron said jokingly, not knowing exactly what he meant by it, only that it was the first thought that came to his mind. When Cecil adopted a look of confusion, he added, "Don't worry. I don't hold too high a standard. I'm surprised that you even agreed to see me, when you could have done anything else on a Friday night." "No, it's definitely not a waste of time. When I seemed standoffish that other day, it was only because I was a bit hesitant about seeing anyone just yet. You see, I just got out of a really bad, disastrous relationship, and I don't want to rush into anything." Cecil seemed to be trying to say this in the most honest way she could. "I understand completely. I'll try my best to respect that," said Cameron, struggling to find the right words. "I'm going through some difficult times, too, and I'm not one to rush into things, either. I just know that if I didn't ask you and be upfront about it, I'd have regretted it for the rest of my life, and Lord knows I have enough regrets." He wondered, if perhaps the words Mr. Tiberius would be supportive or besmirching at this point. Yes, I'm perfectly fine with honesty. The world could use a lot more of it, she said, looking downward and folding her hands together as if hiding something clandestine. I agree completely. The world could use more of it. And I'm not just trying to be a yes man. I'm just trying to be, well, agreeable, Cameron muttered, in a way that was incidentally comedic to the point that Cecil almost chuckled and smiled with a sense of accomplishment. That's no problem. I have an issue with that too sometimes. I'll be so friendly and courteous that some guys will mistake it for flirting, when all I intended to do is be nice, Cecil confessed, now unfolding her hands and being more visibly open. This confession made Cameron slightly less troubled. Was he one of those guys who misread her friendliness? Despite these doubts, he continued. What a curse it is in this world to be nice. Either you're seen as sycophantic and not worth the time, or coquettish and facetious. It's almost as if we're better off being tactless instead, just to save us the trouble. Sorry, I don't mean to sound pessimistic. This is just coming from somebody who's spent his whole life being nice, and having nothing to show for it, Cameron said with a sense of ostensible bitterness. You're too hard on yourself, said Cecil empathetically. I think you're wrong when you say that you have nothing to show for it. Success shouldn't be categorized as this black and white, impossible standard to achieve. It's different for everybody. In your life, when you've told me, you've achieved financial security, a steady career, even if you claim it's a dead one, in your own house, and you have a steady job. That's more than what most people have. You're doing just fine. You're just in a bit of a rut, that's all. I know, maybe I should be more optimistic about it. But then again, what does it matter if I have my own home, car, and a secure career? If I'm empty and lacking direction, I think I messed up somewhere a long time ago, and that it's my fault. You really don't think all those things aren't worthwhile? Don't be such a perfectionist. Some people would kill to have that. I know I would. I still haven't even paid off all my college debt I racked up years ago, said Cecil, maintaining her characteristic merriment. All I know is that there is more, much more to life than simply going to college without having genuinely decided on what you want to do for a living, compiling debts, as you yourself admit, which I am no stranger to, getting a steady job, leasing and eventually owning a house, and starting a family. There's something just about that whole package that rubs me the wrong way. It's too reductive, and only leaves you unsated and in a constant cyclical state of wanting more. Once you buy the house, for example, that the inevitable rise of inadequacies suddenly shows up again. So you go on to the next big thing. Let's say you get that management position you dreamt of for years, and now you even have your mortgage paid off. You're still unsatisfied. So you find someone to fall in love with, who loves you back, and maybe start a family. But even this doesn't satisfy you. So you crave more. And even if this whole world were cured of every possible flaw, from disease, starvation, war, crime, and we got to the point where everyone was magically engineered to be perfect little human prototypes without a single flaw, we would still cry out more and more and more. And there's nothing we can do about it, except maybe, just maybe, not to care so much about any of it. To just take it a tad bit less seriously. Because it's really trivial, circuitous, and ultimately meaningless. After all, we're these tiny orbs of carbon floating aimlessly around the cosmos with no finite, meaningful purpose, save for what we find meaningful ourselves. I'm sorry for coming off as pessimistic. That's just what I begun to think, Cameron said, all this with varying degrees of passion, tempered with calmly stated candor. While he was emphasizing the futility of human life, the prospect didn't bother him as much as it once had, and he even found an odd semblance of inner peace in saying it out loud. I get where you're coming from. I understand completely. But would you really say that raising a family is meaningless? I came from a family of 4 and my parents were exceptional people. I get what you mean when you say that our tiny little lives are so fickle in comparison to the grand scope of the universe, but I think the contrary. I believe that we all have a purpose and a duty to fulfill. Even if that means simply being true to yourself, or if it's achieving some gargantuan dream of yours. Whatever it is, we can't lose hope. Hope is the very fuel of our existence. We need it to survive day to day. It's like what Virginia Woolf said about the meaning of life being defined by tiny miracles rather than an all-encompassing, definitive answer. Cecil paused, gathering her thoughts. I suppose my question is, what is it that gives you hope? She asked, sounding slightly ill at ease. Oh no, I don't mean it in that way, Cameron explained. He couldn't help but blush when she asked him what gave him hope, and wished in the depths of his daftness to cry out that it was her that gave him hope, and defined the zenith of his otherwise prosaic life. Though he saw Cecil sitting before him, he feared, like Mr. Tiberius and other mere dreams or projections, that she wasn't real. Maybe she too was almost too faultless to be true, and he feared that he could jinx it at any moment if he didn't play his cards right, so he kept some of his feelings inside. It's certainly a difficult matter. For some, that's just how they define their existence, and I respect them immensely. The world needs more families and people devoted to their roles. But when people go about their lives giving no thought to the whys, it begins to look a bit aimless. Cameron could see that Cecil had been slightly offended by his remark about family, roles, and work, and that, when Cameron had referred to them in such a manner, it caught her off guard. Yes, this is true. But when people ask why too much, things begin to fall apart, Cecil said. People can become nihilistic and sedentary, too analytical to even take action or live life. Would you say that you might think of having children, eventually? She seemed to be asking this out of spontaneous curiosity and to have added them eventually to make sure her remarks didn't come off as too intimidating. Well, I'm not certainly opposed to the idea. You see, questions like that are so much more complicated than people initially consider them to be. It depends on so many other factors. Everyone in the world assumes that when we make the claim that we desire something, for example, we only reveal that we aren't remotely aware of what the alternative might have been, and there's no feasible way of knowing. We are being dishonest. We should admit that when we take a path in life, it's not because we chose on our own volition and goodwill. I sure didn't. It's because we couldn't imagine any other possible way this life could have gone. The fact is that we're pressured into it by anxiety, guilt, and fear. We root our decisions in all those and forsake our true passions, which are rooted in our deepest, most authentic inclinations, and we settle for something more closely resembling monotony incarnate. Temporary filler job, like a nursery for the dead men of society with nothing left to live for. Early retirement, and we call these places our dream jobs. We're lying to ourselves. We cast a spell of temporary allure mixed in bad faith and cast our nets and stake all our worth into it. And before you know it, your life is over. Or at least it might as well be. Because if your job can be summarized in 2 or fewer sentences, and you spend all your waking time serving it, who is really the leader of their soul, captain of their ship? I certainly don't feel like it. We lie to ourselves when we claim there couldn't have been it any other way. There is a myriad of other alternatives to this life. The universe is constantly changing, and we can't do anything to stop it. It's the vast expanse that grows, driven by entropy, every which way, and there's nothing we can do to stop or control it. And it doesn't care what we think, believe, or feel. We can only tend to our own little miseries and call it a day. It's the best we can do. Cameron went into a kind of daze when he spoke and lost sense of his surroundings. Cecil looked on with an apparent sense of ambivalence. I mostly agree with what you're saying, and I just don't want to sound agreeable. But what about the people who lead these simple kinds of lives that you find uninteresting and are happy with themselves? To them, the world ends at the suburbs. I understand that there are definitely people out there in positions in life that they deem meaningless or unfulfilling. There are also a number of people, my own family included, who work at seemingly boring jobs and are as content as can be. I think the world needs at least some people who are willing to do those kinds of things. If all of us were iconoclasts or nonconformists, how would our offices, retail stores, or factories run? She said this in a soft tone, in an apparent insurrection against Cameron's views. Well, to that I'd say more power to them. There are people who seem destined to be content with the simple things in life. To them, their small town in the rural Midwest makes them proud. Their little family business nestled in the suburbs or their quiet life in the middle of the middle-class family. And that's perfectly all right. I have no issues with that. They've achieved what they could, did their best, raised families, and brought much-needed reform to the local areas, albeit on a small scale. But they are at the very least honest with themselves and don't impose their ways on others or coerce them into adopting their method as gospel. Instead, these folk are usually respectful and dignified. Actually, Cecil, it is those who succumb to the dry, plodding routine of corporate 9-to-5 world, for example, who have lost my respect. Not just them, but anybody who favors outward success and vanity over humanity and individuality. It is those who sacrifice any notion of civility or meaning in their lives so they can instead have their life planned, coordinated, and slowly sucked away by someone else, typically someone far richer and more powerful. They allow themselves to be pumped full of half-baked ideas and false precepts. They have no power to mold their own unique lives and imbue a sense of distinctiveness on them. They are instead put in the hands of bureaucrats with far less imagination than spite, and are shaped into formless, nondescript, lifeless entities that the Western world wishes them to be. On the outside, it may seem that these suit-and-tie jobs are normal, respectful, hard-working men, but in fact, their eternal narratives and ideas are far more twisted than any horror story. Before they know it, the majority of their lives are gone, and there is no turning back. These are the ones who opted to become company men, who see their careers not as a matter of building character, but as a series of deals ready to be made. They will snatch the higher position, although they know for a fact that a coworker will lose their job as a result, even if it's a petty promotion. That is how committed they are. They will not lose a wink of sleep about it. But it's all fine in the end, because their retirement and 401ks are secured, right? To rob a man of his life, at least let him go out with some money to give his grandkids, so to propagate the cycle ad nauseum. It's like a classic Hegelian's master-slave dialectic. Worker who's low in status is destined to be exploited in the name of the man of higher status. But the master lives a dishonest, shameful life. He cannot go to sleep without knowing for a fact that his whole essence is rooted in the very existence of the slave who does his bidding, because without those toiling for his success he would surely fall. It is only by imbuing a sense of creative reflection in themselves that the slaves gain a kind of sovereignty over their masters. Sorry for getting off track there. It just came up in a book I'm reading. Again, Cameron felt the inevitable pull of an outward influence taking control over his body, and more particularly his words. It was hard to describe what kind of compelling force was affecting him. It seemed like he was doing the talking, that the words were not his own, or that he didn't open his mouth on his own autonomy first, only to feel an external force flow through him, a kind of electricity that powered his every word. Even his voice didn't feel like his own, like a speech that was the contents of somebody else's ideas. And he had an inkling as to who. Cecil looked enthused by what he was saying, nonetheless, and responded in a cordial tone. That's a very unique way of thinking. It's been a while since I've heard the name Hegel. Freshman year of college, to be exact. She let out a sincere, high-spirited laugh and explained, I only remember failing that course and having bad luck with the humanities. I've always been more of a counselor type who wanted to see ideas in action and excelled more at math and economics. In recent years, however, I've enjoyed taking up reading again. Maybe you have some good recommendations. I actually didn't fare too well in school, either, Cameron admitted. I started out as a sort of honor student, winning every prize I could, competing in competitions and such. But by high school, I just completely changed. I failed math, writing, science. The only thing I didn't really flunk was history, and that's only because memory comes easy to me. Maybe easier than I would want to admit. I don't recall, even after high school, being that into books either. I just did my job and went home, and that was about it. In school, I was so impatient because I couldn't wait to finish my studies and work a job during after hours, even if it was hard time. It's like I had already made up my mind of what I wanted to do, but didn't actually know for certain what it was. However, something within me has changed drastically lately. Ideas have just been pouring into my head without any discernible cause. It's like one minute I don't have any knowledge of history, philosophy, or much of anything. Then my brain will be filled with concepts and hordes of knowledge I never even remember absorbing. I've been researching, but more on the side to try to find out what's been going on. I know it sounds crazy. Remember, Cecil, when I spoke to you earlier in the farmer's market, and I suddenly became so arrogant and pushy? It didn't even seem like me. It felt like someone else was speaking through me, if that makes sense. And I'm sorry for that. Cecil was almost speechless. Her mouth was agape, and she held her glass of water still in her hand. At last, she spoke. Wow. It sounds like you're going through a lot, she said understandingly. I'm kind of at a loss for words. Did anything traumatic happen to you? Sometimes an event can trigger something within you to give you these ideas. That's the thing, though. Nothing particularly traumatic has happened in my life. I had a pretty privileged childhood with not many qualms about my upbringing. Though my job is tedious, nothing, well aside from Mr. Singer's constant rantings, which could be considered mildly abusive, has really damaged me. It's more of a slow-burning kind of thing that's been accumulating for years and is now just pouring out. Or maybe into me all at once. You know when you had emotion for a while? Maybe because you're at workplace and you keep almost everything inside. All your judgments, opinions, passions, and concepts are internalized. Then suddenly something breaks down inside and you just feel it all weighing down and you just have to let it out somehow. Maybe this is it. Please don't be put off by my dramatic language. I don't mean this in a weird way at all, but maybe now is my time. My time to break down and defeat and accept my fate. Some people are just not destined for greatness. Sounds like you just need a break, maybe? I mean, these aren't unhealthy thoughts as far as I know. I heard in psychology of this thing called sublimation, which sounds very much what you're talking about. I think it's perfectly normal to feel out of place or unappreciated at times. I certainly did for a while. I still do sometimes. Cameron sunk his face into his palms, but kept his eyes in her direction. And after several seconds, immersed in thought, he spoke. I suppose you're right, but I've been feeling this way for as long as I can remember. I'm beginning to think that it's far more than just a momentary phase or reaction to life events. It's a state of mind. It's an existential reaction to the current state of affairs. But maybe I'm being too melodramatic. No, began Cecil astutely. It makes perfect sense. It's like when people act in a certain way. There are very good, sufficiently logical reasons as to why they are that way. It's like in West Blainesville. The residents are notoriously unmotivated, crass, careless, and prone to breaking the law. I mean, let's be honest. It could be very well that they are reacting against a system that's inherently oppressive. It's like you said about Hegel. Maybe they feel like they're slaves in this scenario. Maybe they want to break free of this restrictive society, and the only way they know how to is to react with the only means available. Actions speak louder than words. Rather than formulating their ideas coherently and rationally, they do what feels most natural. They act out in a zealous rage and misinformed uproar. I know it sounds like I'm giving them too much credit, but it's simply food for thought. To add to that, they never really had the proper opportunities to be educated and develop a healthy, empathetic point of view. Take me, for example. I was raised in a city, but my mother wasn't from here and hated the city with a vengeance. She made it her mission to bring my brother and I up with dignity and honesty. She would guard us against the corruption and greed that was so prevalent around us. And it set our family apart from the rest. That's not to say that I think we're better, but it gives you an insight of where we came from. Cameron was somewhat surprised by her sudden insight. That makes perfect sense, said Cameron, clutching his mug of tea, which had grown lukewarm. I always pegged you as an honorary member of East Blainesville, but I guess a flower is able to grow in even the starkest desert if it's given enough water. He said this in a sudden wave of sensitivity, but felt mildly uncomfortable, as Cecil visibly blushed a little. So he continued. To add to what you're saying, Mark also hypothesized about the corporate elitist bullies deliberately keeping the working class unenlightened and in the dark about educational matters. As a result, they have no way to inform themselves about what's going on around them, politically or economically or philosophically. It's an insidious little tactic to keep those with no power to wield perpetually in the dark, so they don't have to shake things up or compromise the status quo. Again, he felt the magic wand of Mr. Tiberius's words flow through him, but he wasn't certain, as he felt significantly more in control of his thoughts now. Suddenly, he sensed himself losing focus again, and as his mind refocused on Cecil herself, and not the economic, political implications of the working-class citizens. Apologies for getting off track again. I never thought I'd discuss Marxism in a restaurant, observed Cameron wryly, a subtle smile forming on his face. But enough about me. I want to hear more about you, he said, leaning back in his booth, which is purposely meant for two people, although the restaurant was only half full. There's nothing wrong with getting off track. I've spent my whole life doing that. So you want to know more about me? What is there to know? She began somewhat hesitantly, with her characteristic humility revealing itself, and started to tell Cameron everything she could briefly tie together and recall about the salient events in her life. They spoke for another couple of hours, in a flow of conversation that came naturally to both of them, without any awkward false starts or repetitive jokes or gags. That's not to say it wasn't without some hesitancy on both their parts, as they were both comfortably well-behaved, respectful, and affable kinds of people. This set them apart from the rest of West Blainesville, which was marked by disreputably ill-behaved citizens, especially in Cameron and Cecil's place of work, which was likewise dominated by those very same types of people. Those who were insensitive, short-tempered, and obtuse only seemed to gain more of a leg up on everything else, regardless of their merits. Nevertheless, Cameron did succeed that day. He truly connected with someone else, and she reciprocated his interest implicitly, not out of any coercion or pressure, but simply out of a genuine care and interest. Yet not everything continued to fare as well for our Cameron. He was indeed very much still under the perfidious spell of that elusive creature who had revealed himself only in fleeting, incoherent moments as either a product of Cameron's assailed, unhealthy mind, or a fantastical feature of this world concealed in endless reverie and mysticism. He knew that Mr. Tiberius, that spectacle of ecstatic enlightenment fervor, with his transient effete and conveniently posh sophist ripostes and a glimmer of blind wisdom, would appear yet again, and that the nature of the next interaction would be one that would haunt Cameron in the worst degree. How would this come about remained unknown. All he knew was that he would speak to him again in the future. They had to. It was part of the deal, as Mr. Tiberius put it, and there was no going back. Cameron just had a premonition that it would happen, that was not revealed in blatant words or images, but only in the vaguest hints, a tremor of the body, a shiver of the soul. He knew for a fact that the creature was on its way, with its one good eye, with conversation on his mind, and he would not be taking no for an answer.